Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. So the topic of the video today is going to be an application of postmodernism to libertarianism, as far as I've started to notice some situations where libertarians seem to be falling into the trap of what I understand to be postmodern collectivism. This comes from my relatively recent viewing of a Jordan Peterson video where he discusses postmodernism and how it derived from Marxism. And I started looking around, and I'd kind of been seeing these sorts of things happening in the libertarian movement for a while, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what the issue was. So once I started listening to Jordan Peterson and hearing some of the stuff that he was saying about postmodernism and the collectivism inherent in postmodernism, I started to, kind of figure out what was going on here and what I found problematic regarding some of the things I was hearing and seeing come out of the libertarian movement. And looking back, I don't think this is a short-term problem. I think it's been around for a while. So I'm going to apply what I heard in the Jordan Peterson video to a particular speech by a prominent libertarian named Jeff Deist, who gave a speech that became pretty controversial because of his use of the phrase blood and soil. However, I don't think that phrase was actually the particular thing that should have been objectionable in that speech. I'm going to go into that later, but first I want to, and also I'm going to provide a link to the Jordan Peterson video that I watched and also to Jeff Deist's speech. It's called For a New Libertarian, so that you can watch the Jordan Peterson video yourself and you can read Jeff Deist's, you can read his speech yourself, and of course make your own judgments regarding these things and my commentary as well. So what I want to do is I want to start with some of the material from the Jordan Peterson video, where he talks about the history of postmodernism and how it arose from Marxism. And then I'll move into the Jeff Deist speech. So Jordan Peterson talks about how postmodernism derived from Marxism, which sees society as a battleground on the economic front between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So Marxism was fairly popular, and even though theoretically it had, for all practical purposes, been debunked by prominent Austrian economists such as Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek, it still held some prominence until it was pretty much empirically refuted back in the 60s, when the empirical facts of what was going on in, say, the Soviet Union became apparent. So no self-respecting academic could really continue along with claiming to be a Marxist. So they ended up morphing into the postmodern philosophy. So I want to be clear that I'm not an expert philosopher, and I don't claim to be an expert on postmodernism. Pretty much what I'm going to do here is, this is my general understanding of the theory, and through that general understanding I'm going to apply it to the Jeff Deist speech. So I understand if maybe you're a PhD in philosophy, you might find what I have to say somewhat superficial, but this is, again, my commentary. Take it for what it's worth. You don't like it, that's fine, whatever. I just want to be clear that I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm just the interested layman. I'm the interested layman learning about these ideas and applying them. So getting back to Jordan Peterson, in his video, he talks about how the Marxists switched from Marxism into the postmodernist philosophy, where instead of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, they had the oppressed and oppressor classes. So these typically would fall upon like racial lines or religious lines or alternative lifestyle lines, the typical social justice warrior categories. And so what it would come down to is people were no longer viewed as individuals. They were viewed as a member of either the oppressed class or the oppressor class or some combination thereof. And so this led to the analysis along called intersectionality, where there would be an analysis of what classes you belong to. Like say for example, I'm a white male, so I fall under the collective categories of being white, being a man, so I guess those two would put me in the oppressor class. But the critical feature here to remember is that what postmodernism did was it would stop treating people as individuals and turn them into collections, into like an amalgam of their group collective affiliations. So the individual is destroyed in favor of group collective analysis. And this is the critical feature that I have been seeing in the libertarian movement, and at least in part was brought about or was utilized in Jeff Deist's For a New Liberty speech. His entire speech, I would not say that his entire speech was postmodernist, but there were a lot of heavy postmodernist arguments in it, and a whole lot of postmodernist analysis that I didn't like and I thought was actually detrimental to the libertarian movement. And I'm going to get into those things later. And there's other problems with the speech that I'm also going to talk about. But basically what I wanted to do here initially was to discuss Jordan Peterson's brief history of postmodernism and how it arose from Marxism. So that can sort of set the groundwork for what I'm going to do with respect to the Jeff Deist For a New Libertarian speech. So moving along to the Jeff Deist For a New Libertarian speech, I'm going to just sort of start at the beginning with it and move along till the end. So he begins with some introductory comments, and he starts off talking about self-ownership and private property and so forth. So these are kind of this is the basics of libertarian theory, sort of the foundation upon which everything else is built upon, like for example the non-aggression principle. So you believe that the libertarians believe in self-ownership and that you have control over your body, and private property, which is you have control over property that you have homesteaded or that have acquired via voluntary transaction or interaction with other people. So this sets the groundwork for the libertarian political edifice as far as ethics, political ethics are concerned, regarding what people have the legitimate authority to use force, what circumstances under which they are allowed to use force in defense of themselves or their property. So he talks about how libertarians have sometimes been hostile towards various traditional values like tribe, faith, community, religion, and that sort of thing, and that in a sense libertarianism reduces people to soulless, hyper-rational economic actors. And he also makes a comment that better, not perfect, should be our motto, which would seem to imply that he seems to think that there are libertarians that are arguing for perfection in some sense. Now, that's kind of, I'm not even really sure what perfection would even be in this scenario, because I don't know of anyone that thinks that perfection is a reasonable goal, nor am I aware of many libertarians that just out of hand reject all of those traditional values that Deist talks about with respect to religion, family, tribe, and those sorts of, culturally, generally what you would define as culturally conservative values. So my impression, just to begin with, is that he seems to be erecting somewhat of a straw man, in that I don't think that these are widespread problems in the libertarian movement. I don't think that there is a significantly large proportion of the libertarian movement that actually believes that all of those things, all of those culturally conservative values should, as a matter of implementing libertarianism, should be rejected. And that I believe he talks about these people believe that these things need to be shed from people in order to bring about libertarianism. So in order to have libertarianism, you have to let go of all of these things and become a hyper-rational economic being. But again, I don't see very many libertarians making this case. So I'm not really sure who he's talking about. Maybe, I'm certain that there's maybe a few people out there going on about this, but I don't recall many, if any at all, off the top of my head, prominent libertarians or libertarians in general that make this argument that you must shed these particular conservative cultural values in order for there to be libertarianism. Speaking for myself, personally, I think that the libertarian philosophy is easily capable of incorporating all of these values. In fact, that's the beauty of libertarianism, is that it can accommodate a wide array of cultural values, whether they be conservative, liberal, alternative, even a lot of people will, and I'll talk about this also later. A lot of people in the libertarian movement tend to reject social justice warrior values, and again, these things are not necessarily incompatible with libertarianism, but I'm going to get to that later. So just off the bat, just his introductory comments seem a little bit strange, and I don't see how this is a productive way to start the speech. I don't think that these problems that he talks about are a large issue, and I don't think that they're the sort of thing that we need to rectify, in that it's not common enough. There aren't enough people making these cases for them to be for it to be an issue. In fact, he seems to be promoting the caricature libertarian that anti-libertarians like to bring up. It's sort of a criticism that you'll hear people say is, oh, libertarians, they believe in quote-unquote economic man who acts only in economic interest. This is very common outside of libertarian circles as a criticism of libertarians. And it's very strange that Deist, just right off the bat, caves into these, in my opinion, false representations of libertarians. So right from the beginning, the speech runs into issues and seems to be going down a bad path. So again, I don't see where he's initially going with this. Well, I know ultimately after I read the speech, I saw where he was going, but I don't think that these criticisms are accurate, and I don't think his description is accurate in his introductory comments. So continuing on with Jeff Deist's For New Libertarian speech, his next section has to do with civil society. Now, civil society is voluntary cooperation and organization among people with a shared interest or shared values. So it's pretty much the private provision of various services that in many instances are things that are provided by the government, but were previously provided through what was known as civil society. So Deist in this section goes back to his statement, which I don't believe is accurate, that libertarians have shown to be hostile to various culturally conservative values relating to family, religion, and so on and so forth. And then he makes the conclusion based on this, that they end up showing themselves to be hostile to civil society itself. But the problem here is, well, first of all, it's, as I said previously, it's an open question whether libertarians are in fact hostile to all of these things. The other problem is he conflates these cultural conservative values with civil society. And the important thing to remember is, say, some organization, some civil society organization, which was created out of a common religious interest or religious bond amongst different people. This is simply an instance of civil society. This is not civil society in general. So it's not correct to say that even if we accept his argument that libertarians are hostile to all of these things, which again, not necessarily established, but even if we did, it would not follow that it means that libertarians are hostile to civil society in general. To put this another way, to use an example, it would be like somebody saying, well, you know what, Jason? You don't like football and you don't like basketball, so therefore you don't like sports. Of course, football and basketball are themselves sports, but so are many other things. And the fact that I simply do not like those two particular sports does not mean that I don't like sports in general. Similarly, even if we could establish that libertarians, or if Deist himself, not me, Deist could establish that libertarians were in fact hostile to those things, to civil society organizations along those culturally conservative lines, it would not establish that they are hostile to civil society in general. It would simply mean that they don't like civil society organizations that are promoting those particular values, which is fine. That is not a rejection of civil society. So right off the bat here, we find him engaging in a non sequitur. The other thing is, civil society like the civil society organizations are created based upon common interests or common values amongst groups of people. And those values are subjective to the person or group of people that are engaging in them. So while yes, it is accurate to say that these culturally conservative values are part of civil society, it is also accurate that, say, non-culturally conservative values are also part of civil society. So, for example, we could go all the way to the extreme of the regressive left. There is no contradiction in somebody being a raging leftist libertarian and saying, you know what, I don't believe in the government. I don't believe in the government making all these decisions. I firmly believe in self-ownership and property rights. And I believe in civil society, and saying that I think that there should be organizations that promote, say, the homosexual lifestyle or a drug lifestyle. This is perfectly consistent with civil society, and yet Deist seems to be rejecting these things in favor of his preferred culturally conservative values. So again, we have a problem where Deist is simply conflating things that necessarily do not tie together. Civil society is not necessarily a representation or an expression of culturally conservative values. It is also, or at least can be, perfectly consistent with libertarian values that alternative lifestyles, which someone like Deist would not consider culturally conservative, could be expressed and promoted via civil society organizations, which are created among people that share those particular values. So Deist, right off the bat, again, conflates things that are not necessarily, that should not necessarily be tied together, and misunderstands exactly what civil society is and the applications which it can be used for. So again, in this second section relating to civil society, he is off to a pretty bad start, in my opinion. So continuing on with Jeff Deist's section regarding civil society, he continues on by saying that he talks about family and religion, and he says that family and religion are bulwarks against the intrusion of the state, and therefore the state has attacked these things throughout history. Now, it's in my opinion, I don't think this is an accurate statement. I do think that I think that it is more accurate to say that the state has manipulated these things, manipulated families and religions, and maybe influenced them in order to gain support. I do not think that family and religious values in any way necessarily are in opposition to the state. In fact, there are many family and religious traditions that are explicitly in support of the state. So to take an example, if you consult pretty much any mainstream religious leader, like say a priest or like a Christian priest or a Jewish rabbi or pretty much anybody, all of the mainstream religions pretty much preach obedience to the civil authority. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to this, but overall, if I were to walk into the nearest church, let's say the nearest Catholic church, considering my family is Italian, so most of my family are Catholics, and if I were to go into that church and ask the priest, so what is the church's opinion regarding the government? I would be told to obey all the laws and to obey the civil authority. And that's pretty standard for most any religion. So to say that there is this inherent tension between a religion and the state simply isn't true. And to say that, religious affiliation or religious devotion necessarily means that it is necessarily in opposition to the state, that simply doesn't follow. Religion can and usually is used as a means of justifying the state's existence and authority. And the same is true for families. There are many family traditions where service to the public authority is encouraged and promoted, and some various family members could be rejected from the family because they don't go along with it. There are many families that they're very proud of the service, previous generation's service to the military and to the police. And so to say that families inherently are in tension or act in opposition to the state simply doesn't follow. In fact, in many cases, the opposite is true. Family traditions and family values will serve as support for the state. So to say that the state is attacking these things isn't really true. It may be that I think it is much more accurate to say that through propaganda and various other government programs, the state will manipulate these various institutions, like religious institutions, and influence family structure and traditions to gain support. So to simply say being pro-family and pro-religion means that you're anti-state simply doesn't follow. There's no necessary connection between those two things, and in many instances it runs counter to that, wherein those things are explicitly in support of the government and government authority. So Deist also, continuing along these lines, Deist also says that as you roll back the state, civil society will flourish. So I would say that this is something that I agree with Jeff Deist on. This is one of the parts of the speech that I'm in full agreement with. As the size and authority of the government is rolled back, civil society will flourish to take over providing those goods and services that the government does. Like, for example, public roads, pretty much all public infrastructure would most likely in some manner be taken over by civil society. There's a lot of social services, welfare, healthcare services. These things were like catastrophic health insurance, and unemployment insurance, that sort of thing. And these things were, if you look back in history, prior to the government getting involved with them, these things were provided through private civil society. So yes, I agree with Jeff Deist on this point that as the state is rolled back, civil society will grow and flourish. And I would say, and I'm sure that Jeff Deist would agree with me, that this would be an absolutely overwhelmingly positive development for these particular services and other goods to be transitioned from being provided by the government to being provided by private voluntary civil society. I agree with that. However, he draws the conclusion that as a consequence of this, the culture will become more conservative. Now, this ties back into his previous conflation of culturally conservative values with civil society, which is, as I pointed out earlier, not necessarily true. There is no contradiction between culturally liberal social values and civil society. You can be culturally liberal and accept self-ownership and private property, and accept the concept of private voluntary civil society providing these social services and other public goods and services, but just feel that they should be providing them, be promoting liberal social values. So things like I said previously, maybe this could entail something like communities that are geared towards catering to left-leaning alternative lifestyles. There's the big controversy nowadays over gender pronouns, gender identity, and so on and so forth. There is no contradiction at all between promoting those things and accepting civil society. All it could mean is, in this sense, building voluntary communities through creating civil society organizations which cater to people who who consider gender identity a spectrum as opposed to a binary equation where you're either where there's only two genders as opposed to a spectrum of genders. Again, no contradiction at all. So Deist is pretty much incorrect when he says that when civil society comes back to the forefront, while as the state is rolled back, that this necessarily means that the culture will become more conservative. That simply is not true. It could become more conservative, but then again, it might not. There's no way to tell. And of critical importance is to understand that there is no necessary link between civil society and conservative cultural values. This is very, very important to understand. You can be left-leaning and also believe in libertarianism and civil society. So here Deist makes a very critical error, and I do not believe that this part of the speech is correct, and I do not think that making these arguments is going to help the libertarian movement going forward. So moving along with the Jeff Deist For New Libertarian speech in his section relating to civil society, Deist continues on and says that civil society, unlike the state, which cannot typically impose conditions upon, or it's much more difficult to impose conditions upon people that take advantage of these social arrangements, civil society organizations, being voluntary in nature, can place conditions upon people that are members or take advantage of the benefits thereof. And this in and of itself is pretty much a true statement. If you're part of a voluntary organization, there's going to be restrictions and rules involved with it that you voluntarily agree to. However, Deist makes the incorrect statement that these conditions, he makes the incorrect conclusion that these conditions will be culturally conservative in nature. This simply is not the case. It doesn't simply follow that you will have these conditions will be conservative in nature, because, as previously pointed out, there is no contradiction between left-leaning alternative lifestyle civil society and civil society in general. So the idea that because of this, as the state is rolled back and civil society flourishes, that the conditions being placed on people to participate in civil society will be conservative in nature simply does not follow. They could just as easily be left-leaning in nature as opposed to right-leaning in nature. And that, again, it simply, this conflation of these two things simply does not follow. Moving on again, Deist also says that libertarians should support civil society when they have the chance. But yes, and I definitely agree with him on this. However, given what he has said in the speech up until now, it is clear that Deist regards civil society as a necessary expression of conservative cultural values, in that he conflates the two together, even though he makes a comment at some point in the speech about how there's an infinite array of particular of civil society an infinite possibility. There are infinite possibilities for civil society organizations. It is clear from the bulk of his speech that he is equating the two. That he equates civil society with conservative values, or that at a minimum he feels that the growth of civil society will necessarily lead to the expansion and promotion of conservative cultural values. But this simply is not the case. And there is no necessary link, again, I've said this a number of times, there is no necessary link between civil society and cultural conservatism. Left-leaning cultural values are completely compatible with civil society. And this is a very important, and this is something that Deist does not make explicit in his speech. He does not acknowledge this. And as libertarians, I think that we should acknowledge this and make sure that it is understood that regardless of what your cultural values are, libertarianism, A, does not contradict them, B, is probably the best way to implement your cultural values. In fact, I would say definitively, libertarian private voluntary action, regardless of what your beliefs are, unless your beliefs are that theft and murder are good, but beyond that, pretty much any cultural value, left or right leaning, is accommodated and implemented far better from a pragmatic standpoint than being implemented via the state. It's implementing these things via the state is pretty destructive and counterproductive. So it's very important to make that distinction and to understand these things, and to make sure that when you're promoting and supporting civil society, that you are ensuring that you are acknowledging that it accommodates both left and right-leaning social values. Even if you don't agree with left-leaning social values, it is important to acknowledge that civil society and libertarian ethics can accommodate those things. So I want to make a further comment here. I mentioned at the very beginning of this video postmodernism and how I thought that there were, in the Jeff Deist speech, areas that were clearly postmodernist in thinking. His treatment of civil society pretty much infects the libertarian movement with postmodernism, because he believes he is using group affiliation based upon conservative cultural values of, say, religion, family, and national origin, as he's using these things as ways. He thinks that libertarians should use these things to promote the libertarian movement. So it's not the libertarian principles that should be promoted. We should be utilizing group affiliation to appeal to people and linking by necessity these group affiliations, which are merely his personal preferences, to the libertarian movement in an attempt to promote them. And I think that this pretty much, I believe this is counterproductive, and I think this is wrong. At a minimum, what you're doing is you're alienating approximately half of the population if you're simply conflating libertarianism, civil society, and conservative cultural values. You've pretty much alienated the nearly 50% of the population that does not hold those cultural values, who maybe could be convinced of the libertarian position, if not for the fact that they have to supposedly also accept conservative cultural values. So this is an instance of postmodernist collectivist thinking infecting the libertarian movement in the Jeff Deist speech. And again, I don't believe that this is a positive thing. I think this is a very negative thing. And I do not agree with it. I think this is bad. I think that this will place a very hard limit on how far and wide libertarianism can be spread. So the next section in the Jeff Deist speech for New Libertarian has to do with political universalism. And what he does here is he refers to political universalism as sort of a de facto global state, and that because of this, political universalism is a bad thing. So this is sort of correct as far as it goes. However, the problem, the only thing that should be universally accepted, as far as like the only political universalism, should be self-ownership and private property rights. So the problem isn't necessarily that there is a universal global level organization. The problem is that this organization, like a global state, violates people's rights. So it's not necessarily political globalism per se that is the problem. It is what political values are being universalized across the globe. A global state is bad. A global organization that is completely voluntary in nature is good. So, and it's also a little bit strange for Deist to object to these to political universalism, because he himself adheres to these libertarian values. He agrees with self-ownership, and he agrees with He agrees with the idea of private property rights, and presumably he would want these things implemented worldwide. So is that a problem? I mean, would he reject, say, a global level organization that was completely in accord with these values, that implemented and defended private property rights and self-ownership? I would hope that the answer to that would be no. So the problem is not global, like a global level organization or universalism that covers the globe. The problem is what values and what political theories are being implemented. Statism across the globe is bad, but statism across the county that I live in, which is obviously much smaller than the globe, is also bad. So the problem that Deist makes, I mean, his error is to equate political universalism with a political state. He seems to be equating size of organization with anti-libertarian principles, which simply is not the case. This is I think I would consider this a logical error. The problem, what needs to be done is the universalization of self-ownership and private property rights, and whatever organizations come about after those things are implemented are fine, regardless of whatever size they are, as long as they respect self-ownership and private property rights. And again, these are things that Deist himself adheres to and believes in, are fine. And the size of these organizations is not the issue. The nature of them is the issue. So we should oppose, yeah, I mean, sure, global states should be opposed, but it's not the fact that they are global and universalize principles across, say, the entire population of the world. It is the particular principles that are being universalized. So in that sense, I don't think that this is a productive discussion that he's, I think this is a confusion that he is creating. It's by confusing the size or the scope of the organization with the nature of the organization. We shouldn't necessarily object to the size and scope as long as the nature is itself fine. So I think that this confuses the issue, and I don't think that this is a productive start to discussing political universalism. And he makes further errors later on discussing it, which I'll now get into. Continuing along with the political universalism section of the Jeff Deist speech, after those introductory comments, he makes a really bad turn by saying that libertarians should seize upon the nationalistic rhetoric that is coming around, that is being tossed around a lot all over the place. And he thinks that this should be done because it opposes globalism. So this is really kind of astonishing to hear a libertarian say these things, although this sort of rhetoric this sort of argumentation has become common lately. It seems like libertarians have become so infatuated with opposing global level statism that they are now embracing national level statism. So what Deist is explicitly saying is that libertarians should grab upon nationalist rhetoric and use that to promote libertarian values, to promote libertarian principles. The problem is that nationalism is explicitly anti-libertarian. Nationalist politics are anti-libertarian. They do not promote the free market. They are anti-free immigration. And I understand that there are some libertarians that say that opposing free immigration is the supposed libertarian, the correct libertarian position. These libertarians are wrong, and I have made an 8-video series proving it, and I will include a link to that playlist on YouTube. nationalist rhetoric, the nationalist movement is explicitly anti-libertarian. It is pro-military, it is pro-police, it is pro-police, pretty much anything having to do with the police. It is pro-expansion of the military, it is pro-interventionist politics, interventionist foreign policy. It is not libertarian, and embracing this is not libertarian. Saying that, and simply saying, well, it is the nationalist political movements are against the globalist political movements. My reply to that is, so what? So what? The mere fact that something is in opposition to another thing which is bad does not make that thing good. Hitler opposed Stalin, Stalin opposed Hitler. Does that make either of them good? No. To embrace these things is to reject libertarianism for some, I don't know, pragmatic reason. It's kind of bewildering to hear these things. But the bottom line is, nationalism is explicitly and highly anti-libertarian, and you are not going to promote libertarianism by aping their rhetoric in an attempt to somehow maybe slip libertarianism in through the back door with some of these people. Sorry, I don't see how that's going to work. You can the correct libertarian position is to oppose both globalist statism and nationalist statism. You're being inconsistent if you embrace one and reject the other. It doesn't make any sense to say, well, nationalism is good, globalism is bad. Maybe the argument is, well, nationalism is less bad. Well, I'm sorry, that is not proven. To say that national level statism is better than global level statism, I don't see how that has been subjected to any sort of rigorous logical or empirical proof. And I would be astonished if that could be the case. But really what it comes down to is you are embracing one form of anti-libertarian principles because you have some sort of preference for maybe a few of the values that some of the people hold that also hold that position in opposition to something else. And Deist makes some he makes some highly rhetorical comments about a Buddhist is not a Rastafarianism, Mecca is not, and I can't remember the exact quote, but he goes on and on about should we convert everybody to thorough Rothbardians? Should we worry about gay marriage in Saudi Arabia? And he has this really long quote where he makes these comments. Shouldn't Malta be Maltese? And here he just dives right into the postmodernist collectivist groupthink, just unabashedly jumps right into it. We should support political organizations or political movements based upon national origin and religion. Just jumps right into it. This is one of the most virulent infections of postmodernism in the libertarian movement I have ever seen. So, and the thing is, this isn't logical analysis. This is simply empty hot air rhetoric. So Malta should be Maltese? Oh, okay. Well, what about the unorthodox Maltese, the unorthodox person living on Malta, who is now subject to oppressive state regulations by the Maltese national government, thanks to the non-political universalism of the national political movements. The issue is not the level of the government, but whether the rights of people are being violated. So again, all of these comments are empty rhetoric. So a Buddhist is not a Rastafarian. Okay, big deal. Two Buddhists are not the same. Two Irishmen are not the same. Two Saudi Arabians are not the same. Deist is just going like a freight train straight right into the postmodernist collectivist group speak. People are not individuals. When you in this analysis that he's making, people are not individuals. They are simply their national origin, their religion, and this is, again, highly anti-libertarian to go this road. This does not promote libertarian values that people have individual private property and self-ownership rights, and that they are free to form bonds of voluntary cooperation with whoever they wish, whatever group of people or individuals they wish. Their rights are based upon the fact that they are human beings. It is not based upon cultural values that they hold, where they were born, what religion they aspire to. None of that matters with respect to what rights they have. And to link these two things together is, again, it's pretty much the right-wing libertarian version of the left-wing social justice warrior movement of intersectionality, oppressor classes and oppressed classes. It's simply substituting different group affiliations for the ones that the left wing likes to utilize. And it is very disheartening for me to see a very prominent libertarian making these arguments. I think that this is bad. I think that this will not help to promote libertarian values. I think that this will, if anything, alienate large portions of the population from accepting libertarian principles. And I think that the postmodernist influence here is readily apparent, and I think it is a overwhelmingly negative influence. So to just give a brief summation of the political universalism section, the critical factor is not the size of the organizations in question or their scope, but whether they're being created and implementing their values in a voluntary manner, and whether they are in accord with libertarian property rights. These property rights are given to individuals based on the fact that they are human beings. They are not related to any sort of group affiliation, and this group affiliation should not be a criteria for determining whether certain political instances, certain political actions are criminal or not. If something violates people's property rights, whether it is a national government or a global government or a state government, that is all beside the point. The critical factor is whether individual self-ownership and property rights are respected. If they are respected by an organization, then fine. If they are not, then that organization is a criminal organization and should be opposed. By interjecting these postmodernist collective groups, this is confusing the narrative and only serves by talking about a certain particular collection of these groups as being pivotal to promoting libertarian values. All it will do is serve to alienate that population, that percentage of the population which does not hold to those particular values or are not part of that group affiliation. So by destroying the individual analysis of politics, the postmodernist rhetoric, the postmodernist philosophy is, in my opinion, in this case, particularly in the Jeff Deist speech here, infecting the libertarian movement and is, again, overwhelmingly negative. In the final section of Jeff Deist's For New Libertarian speech, he asks, what would you fight for? And he draws he makes some analysis based on this. And he points out that most people will fight for, are willing to fight for their family, their friends, and the region that they live in. He sort of talks about sometimes people will fight for abstract principles, but he kind of tries to make the case that, okay, so say the U.S. military is in some foreign country under the guise of, say, fighting for democracy or some abstract principle like democracy. Deist tries to refute this by saying that, well, when people are in the foxhole, they're fighting for their comrades in arms. They're fighting for the people in the foxhole with them. They're fighting for their fellow soldiers. Well, even if this was totally true, I'm really not sure what the point of all of this is by saying that, well, people will fight for their family, friends, and country, or the region that they live in. Even if we accept that people will fight for their soldiers in the foxhole, I think he ignores the fact that one of the biggest reasons why people will sign up for the military and go and fight in these wars is because they believe in some abstract principle of quote-unquote freedom, and I use freedom in quotes because governments do not spread freedom, or some abstract principle like democracy where they think that people should be freed to engage in people should be subject to a democratic republic government, and somehow this is makes them more free. So yes, abstract principles, I think, cannot be ignored when it comes to determining what people will fight for. But having said that, yes, obviously people will fight for their family, friends, and the region that they live in. And this is where Jeff Deist, this section is where he makes the critical statement that quote-unquote blood and soil still matter to people, and libertarians ignore this at their peril. So that phrase was very controversial. If you're not aware, that blood and soil was a Nazi slogan, and is a very common thing for neo-Nazis or neo-fascists and white supremacists to use, to say. So I want to be clear, I absolutely do not think that Deist is a Nazi or a fascist or a white supremacist. I also do not think that when he made that comment or used that phrase, he was trying to make some sort of dog whistle to neo-fascists and white supremacists or white nationalists. I think, and I've heard that, and I haven't investigated this to make certain, I've heard that he was poking fun at a Jeffrey Tucker article. I think that would be a believable explanation, but having said that, I don't, my interpretation here is that using this particular phrase I don't think it was the best phrasing. I don't think that using it was good because it's a very divisive thing. I think he could have worded this better, but again, I don't think he's a Nazi. I don't think he's dog whistling to Nazis or white nationalists or white supremacists. And I think that all of the controversy centered around this particular phrase has distracted from the real, very critical problems that exist in his speech, which I have outlined previously. When you read the speech, to sum it all up, it is very clear that Jeff Deist feels that political organizations which fall along nationalist or religious lines and culturally conservative lines are better than political organizations that fall along, say, left-leaning lines. Now, the problem here is that it's not so much the cultural values expressed via the state that is the issue. It's that the state is being used to promote and implement those values. The state being an institution which necessarily violates people's rights is not the correct institution to be implementing these things. So when Deist makes this argument that those political organizations which are culturally conservative or promote nationalist or religious lines, or political organizations that fall along nationalist or religious lines, are to be favored by libertarians, and libertarianism should be promoted by embracing or appealing to those nationalist political movements. All he's doing is substituting his own subjective preferences for those of other people. That's all that this is. Deist is obviously a cultural conservative. He obviously believes in he has a certain idea of what a family structure is. He has a certain idea of what civil society is. So whatever political movement agrees with that, whether any political movement that superficially has those structures are ones that he favors. Anything that does not have it are political movements that he does not favor. Now, again, the problem is not what particular values are being promoted or along which group lines. And again, to reiterate and make clear, this is simply applying the postmodernist group identity in a different manner, in a, shall we say, a right-wing cultural conservative manner, as opposed to a left-wing social justice warrior manner, and applying these postmodernist group categories to political movements and determining which political movements are good or bad based upon those group affiliations. So this is the problem with his speech. And again, the critical factor when assessing and analyzing political movements or political actions, again, is whether they violate individual self-ownership and property rights. Whether an institution is good or bad is determined by whether they are in accord or violate those rights. And those rights are individual rights and not contingent upon whatever left or right-wing group affiliation you happen to favor. And again, the fact that Jeff Deist clearly favors culturally conservative and religious nationalist groups versus whatever left-wing group affiliations that are out there, this is again simply his own personal preferences. And by saying that, by promoting the idea that libertarians should embrace these things, it is a distraction from making the argument to people that self-ownership and private property rights are the correct way to implement whatever values that they hold dear. Assuming that those values do not violate those particular rights. And again, and I want to be clear because I know that somebody is going to watch this and say, well, communists can't accept these things. You can't promote something like left-wing communism. Look, if a communist said, you know what, I can respect somebody else's self-ownership and property rights, and I can let go of, forcing everybody to engage in communism. And they can say, I believe in voluntary communism, and the only people that should be a part of whatever communist commune that they want to live in, as long as it is voluntary and does not force this on other people, yes, it can be, under those circumstances, completely in accord with libertarian property rights. And so I'd like to conclude this by taking the good from the speech and altering the message a little bit. The best thing about the speech, I would say, is the focus on civil society. I think that he says, Deist makes some very good comments about the importance of civil society in providing services to people, and that libertarians should absolutely promote these things. Again, I'm not going to reiterate all my issues with where he goes with it, but I think that the good takeaway here is for libertarians to promote civil society, and as far as evangelism goes, as far as spreading the libertarian message and promoting it, to use whatever people's values are, whether they be left-leaning or right-leaning. The proper course of action is, again, not to ignore these things. And again, I want to be clear, being aware of what people's preferences are is one thing. Embracing and promoting political movements based upon those things is another thing. Those are not two identical strategies. It is not the same to be aware that somebody is very religious and to craft the pro-liberty message based upon this. It is another thing to embrace and promote, say, a pro-religious state political movement, which would most likely and probably in almost all cases violate people's rights merely because it promotes religious values. The correct way to go about this, I would say, is to be mindful of whatever people's values are, and this again is individual in nature. You cannot simply utilize, these group collectives and group people along those lines and just sort of not deal with them as individuals, but to be mindful of whatever it is that they value, and then to show how implementing libertarian principles of self-ownership and private property would be the best way for them to express those values and to promote those values, to show how civil society would flourish based upon people with whatever values they hold, whether they be left or right-leaning, allowing voluntary civil society organizations to grow, and rolling back the state would allow for these things to be better promoted and to better flourish and to be more productive. That, in my opinion, is the way to go about this, and I think that that is the positive takeaway from the speech, and I think that that is the correct strategy that libertarians should take. Be mindful of whatever it is that people value, but show how voluntary private action based upon libertarian self-ownership and private property rights is a far superior and ethical, morally ethical way to implement those values instead of state organizations and political movements. So this is my takeaway from the Jeff Deist speech. This is my analysis of it, my issues, and how I think that postmodernism pretty much infects it in a very negative manner, and what I think is a better way of looking at things and a better way of promoting libertarian values. So again, this is just my opinion, my thoughts on the matter. I hope you've found them interesting, and I guess that's pretty much it, and I will see you in the next Liberate Raleigh video. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you soon. Bye.